Okay, let's begin this lesson by taking a look at the very basics of the paint function inside of After Effects 6. I've got project 1 open here. It's called Paint Basics, and you can see in my composition window, there's just a white solid in here to which we can apply our paint. Now, if I select this, I'm ready to actually start painting on it, and there's a couple of ways I can actually tell the paint engine to start up. I could go to the effects menu and activate the paint effect and then start to paint after that, but there's a much faster way of getting to that point. If you come up here to your tool palette, you can see that you have 3 painting tools across the top. We have a brush, a clone tool, and an eraser tool. If I go ahead and click on the brush tool, I immediately activate 2 new palettes inside of After Effects 6. First one, which is paint, and that defines pretty much the whole brush that we're working on and how it applies its color. And the second one is the brush tips palette, which deals obviously with the shape of the brush itself. And there's a lot of options in here. However, if I then decide, right, I'm pretty much happy with everything I've got there, I'm just going to go ahead and paint. If I click on the white solid, I will get a warning, and you should be getting this warning too. It does tell you that you can only paint inside a layer window. You can't do it directly inside the composition. So it's only set to once per session. If you do click again, you won't get this dialog box up. But if we go ahead and click OK, and then just hit the Enter key, that will open up a layer window for this solid that we have selected. You can always double check that here. We can see our composition there in the background. This is our layer window. And you can see that my cursor has changed to a circle, which basically indicates that I have a paintbrush. Now, if I go ahead and click on here and start painting, you can see this is exactly what we have. We have a red stroke that's been applied. Now, the paint effect itself was not applied to the layer until we started clicking. It's actually automatic. If I go ahead and hit F3 to bring up the effect controls there, we can see that paint has been applied as a filter. There's really no other settings in here apart from paint on transparent, which I can obviously turn on there, and all these background pixels will be transparent, and this is the only color we will see, so we could see whatever's behind it. But other than that, everything else is driven by the tools and the palettes that we have here. So I just wanted to point that out and show you that it's applied automatically as soon as you start painting. Now, if I just close that down, let's hit Command Z and just back up a few steps so we get back to before the paintbrush stroke was applied. And again, I'm going to come back to the paint palette here and go through some of these settings. And most of these options here are very similar to what you would get inside of Photoshop. We have the very simple ones like the opacity of the paintbrush, the blending modes, and obviously the colors that we have here, which you can always default back to black and white. But just for the start of this, I'm going to click on the color swatch here and just go and choose a new color. Let's maybe paint in blue for now. Go ahead and click OK. Now, the brush size here is again like it is in Photoshop. You have a pop-up menu that shows you all the saved brushes that we have. Each one of them has different sizes or different feather values, as well as certain ones that have angles, so we can do much more calligraphy style writing or painting. But you can also specify the size of the brush on the fly. At the moment, I have a 62 pixel brush, and if I put my cursor in screen, you can see that. However, as a shortcut, I can hold down my Apple key or the Control key on the PC and drag. And if I drag to the right, you'll see my brush size will increase, and you can see that in the paint palette also. The size is going up or down as I drag to the left, and I can define the brush as I go along. So this is a really handy little function. So I can come back down and choose whatever size I need it to be. Let's go for somewhere around 70 or 80, that will do. And then I obviously have things like the blending modes. Now, everything I paint initially is going to be set to a normal blending mode, but I can choose every other blending mode that you would expect to see. And obviously, this is only how the strokes react to each other. If I take colors and just start overlapping them using multiply, obviously they will get darker. So do bear this in mind, and we can give that a try in just a short while. Now, for color also, we have an eyedropper tool on the right-hand side, which works as every other eyedropper tool does in every Adobe application. Just pick up a color from wherever you need it to be. But quite interestingly here, we do have the channels option, which chooses how much color we apply either to the RGB information and not the alpha channel, or the alpha channel on its own, or both of them combined together. So you can actually paint over the colors of an image, even though it's been, say, keyed out, and you can actually spread the color out into the area that was keyed if you used both of these. Well, we're going to use both of them in just a second when we have a look at how to apply this to moving footage. But for now, we can leave it as RGBA. Now, very importantly here, we have a setting that's called duration, and at the moment it is set to constant. And I'll show you the differences between these. We do actually have 4 options under here. I'm going to move my cursor back into the screen. I'm just going to use a slightly smaller brush for this. I'm just using my Apple or Control key to pull the size down because I wish to create something a little bit more detailed. And we're going to work with constant initially, and also see here that we are set to 0 seconds in our timeline. Okay, so we're starting right at the very beginning. If I go ahead and click and drag and apply a paint stroke there, I can see that it takes, a couple of seconds to do that. What it's not doing is recording that time, okay? It's basically saying it's going to give me a constant stroke. That means that from point 0 all the way out to the end of my animation, that will be visible. You see, if we scrub the timeline across, this is visible for the whole period of time, and it is not animated. It hasn't recorded that in an animated function, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that we can't go in and change that later. We do have a start point and an end point keyframe property that we can use in order to pull the stroke back or pull it forwards and animate that later on. But just in its most basic form, constant does very much that. It gives you one constant stroke that you have painted that will appear throughout the whole composition. Now, the next option down, if I just hit Command Z and undo that and make sure, again, we're back at the start of our timeline, the next option is Write On, and this works in a similar way by allowing me to record what I'm doing, but it also records the time. So we're starting here at 0. Again, if we click and drag and start painting a stroke, no matter how long it takes, that has now been recorded. You see, as soon as I stopped there, the screen went completely white. That's because we're now back at frame 0 on the timeline, at which point the stroke is only just starting to be drawn. If you scrub through that timeline, you can see the stroke working its way along at exactly the time that we created it. Now again, it's been assigned an end and start keyframe that we can adjust afterwards, but you can see that it's a very quick and easy way to record the live action of the text or the graphic or the stroke that you're doing and recording that down to the timeline for adjustment later. Again, I'm just going to hit Command Z and just back up to the point where we don't have that stroke anymore, and we can always scrub the timeline just to double check that. I can see my timeline is clear. The next option down is single frame, and it's very straightforward. It creates whatever stroke that you've got here for just one frame duration. So I can paint that on there. If we scrub that timeline, it disappears right after that first frame. That doesn't mean that you couldn't go anywhere else along and paint another one, and that will only appear for that frame as well. It won't be visible before it, and it won't be visible after it, okay? So that's just for that one frame. Again, let's just back up there until that stroke disappears. And then this time you have the final option, which is custom, and you can decide how many frames you actually paint for. So obviously 1 is the default. You could set that up to 2 or 3, whatever you want to specify. Again, whichever paint stroke you then apply, it will do and record for just those few frames, so just the first 2 or 3 until it disappears off screen. So that pretty much defines those 4 options that we have. You then have a choice as to how you wish your paint strokes to draw. What we can do now is look at how we define the paintbrushes themselves in terms of shape and size, and also how we animate them. And most of this will be taken care of initially using the brush tips palette. So again, I'm just going to undo back to the point that we don't have any strokes on that timeline. And let's come across to the brush tips palette and take a look at what we have in here. Now obviously we have the same library of brushes in here that we saw in the paint palette, and you can obviously go up and down through those and choose whichever one you need. Again, holding down the Command or the Control key will allow me to resize it, and you can see that here in the diameter option. If I do click and drag, you can see that value changing as well. But also interestingly, the small graphic that appears in the bottom right-hand window of this palette, we can see that growing and shrinking to give us an idea of what the brush looks like. And obviously it can only preview to a certain point, which is around about, I think, 50 or 60 pixels. Now we also have a couple of other settings in here, such as angle and roundness, which will allow us to do calligraphy brushes like the ones you can see here. So at the moment, the angle doesn't really apply because we have a roundness set of 100%. If I drag that to the left, you'll see as it squashes the brush down, it starts to conform to this 25-degree angle, which you can obviously also click on and drag around to get the angle that you need. Once you've got something like that, it obviously generates very interesting looking strokes when you drag them on the screen. So good illustration style. Again, let's just undo that. We also have a hardness setting here which defines how soft the edge of the brush is. If it's set to 0, it's 100% soft. It's really nicely feathered and will work very well for painting. If we just come back and set the roundness up to 100 again, we can see this a bit more clearly. It's set to 0 right now. Dragging that all the way up to 100 will obviously remove the softness from the edge. There's still a few anti-alias pixels around there, so it's not jagged or aliased, but it's always worth just playing around with these settings and getting the brush that you need. It's not always that you'll use a completely soft brush, so sometimes you'll get somewhere in the middle here, and I'll probably use that when I use the clone tool in just a short while. But again, for now, we can always set it down. Now, spacing will also define how many splats of paint there are basically in each stroke. Normally it's set to 25%. It's the same in Photoshop. That is the default. If I click and drag, you can't really see any definition between each of the points in the paint. But in fact, it's made up of a series of circles that are laid down one after the other. The smaller the spacing is, the more you will notice that. So if I pull this all the way back, let's go down to 1 or 2, If I click and drag, you'll see that the stroke is a lot harder, it's a lot thicker, and that's because there's more paint being applied per second or per pixel even as we move through the stroke. Again, undo that. Let's go the opposite way. Let's drag the spacing out. Let's go to maybe 70 or so %, and this time you'll see the spots very easily, and that's because we've broken up the spacing and asked it to paint almost slower, given the fact that we're painting with a faster brush speed. Okay, so again, it's quite a handy setting for the type of work that you need to do. I'll just undo that and go all the way back down towards the default again of around 20 or 25. Now, very importantly, down the bottom here, we have a menu that's not open and it says Brush Dynamics. If I open that, we can see here we have a separate set of menus, and all of these basically relate to using a pressure-sensitive tablet like a Wacom tablet or even a Wacom screen, and this gives us options to define each of these settings based on the pressure of my pen on the tablet. So at the moment it says the brush dynamic size is set to off. If I go ahead and choose pen pressure for that, and I'll come across here and just again use our shortcut to reduce the size of my brush. Let's get it fairly small. If I now start to draw and I draw very lightly with my pen tool, you can see the stroke is quite light, and then I can paint harder and harder and I get thickness that changes as we go down the stroke. Let's just undo that, try it with a different size. Let's open up a lot larger. Again, just start painting very lightly. Get thicker and thicker as we go, and you can see these things taking shape. And this is all done by using the pressure sensitivity of a pen, which is a wonderful feature to have inside of After Effects. Now, you also have other options to say, well, let's have the sensitivity affect the angle as well. The more that you press, the more the angle can change. The same for the roundness, the same for the opacity, and also the same for the flow that's in the ink. So all of these things can be controlled and used very well when you're using a pressure-sensitive tablet. Here, I will normally just have size set on, and I will choose these at will, but size is normally the one that I would leave set on all of the time. Gives me all the options that I need. Now, that pretty much defines everything that we have to play with here. What I'm going to do is now look at how the brush strokes are handled in the timeline. I'm going to reduce the size of my brush again. I'm actually going to increase the hardness so we get a bit more definition in there. Let's go 50 or 60%, and I'm just going to draw 2 or 3 strokes. So here's my first one. And what we could do is come across to our paint option here. Let's choose a different color for our second stroke. Let's go for maybe an orangey yellow. Let's go ahead and apply our next one. And then I'll come back and choose a different color for this. Let's maybe go for a green color. And I'm also going to change the blending mode at this point from normal, and let's change it to multiply. Okay, so the color will actually overlap whatever it goes on to. And we can see that you now have full blending modes between these strokes. Just going to paint back and forth and maybe cover up the top left-hand side of my composition here. So we've effectively drawn 3 strokes. How does After Effects handle these, and how can we make changes to them? Because basically what's painted here is almost like it's been permanently applied. Well, all of these things can be edited down in the timeline. So let's come down to the timeline itself. And if I hit the E key, it will reveal the paint effect that we have applied. And if we twirl down the options next to it, I can see that I have 3 brush strokes, okay? Each one of those relates to the colors that we just painted. And we can see here that the top one is set to multiply, the color mode that we just applied. Well, we can go ahead and change it now because all of these blending modes can be pulled up. So if I go ahead and choose normal there, you'll see the blending changes on screen and we can see the colors don't overlay anymore. Now, you'll also notice that I have brush 3 highlighted here. I can actually make out a vector path here inside my layer window that shows me all of the shapes that were drawn to create that stroke. So it's sort of an interesting point of reference. And obviously, I'll get one of those for each of the strokes that I click on. We're going to stay on brush 3 for just a second. We have a twirl icon on the left-hand side here, and this is where we can now access all of the properties for this stroke to make any changes that we need. Now, what I'll do before I do that, I'll just hold down my spacebar and just scrub this window down so we can see the stroke a little bit more easily in screen at the same time. Now, if I twirl it down, we have an initial option, which is the brush shape. Now, this allows me to animate the shape from one object to another. Now, do bear in mind at this point, we only have a 3-frame brush stroke because this is what we specified in our paint palette when we set a custom duration of only 3 frames. But it will do for the purposes that I want to show you. If I go ahead and turn on a keyframe here for the shape, we could scrub across to the very last frame of that, or just a couple of frames across. And if I now just got my brush tool and painted something completely different, we can see that the old stroke completely disappears and is replaced with a new one. You'll see I can scrub back and forth between those two, or just use the page up and down keys, and you'll see one frame at a time, it actually morphs from one shape into another. So you can use this for very interesting painting techniques that just simply change shape across time. And that's how the shape changing option works with these new painting tools. So that's just something very important to bear in mind if you do need everything to shift throughout the animation. Now we also have two extra options down here. We have stroke options and transform. Transform is not to be confused with the general transform properties for the layer itself. This transform option is for this particular stroke. Every single stroke has one. If I drop that down, we can see that we have anchor point, position, scale, and rotation settings for every single stroke in our timeline. So position is an easy one to look at. If I pick the X value up here and drag left to right, you'll see that the whole stroke will move across the screen, and obviously this can be animated, so we can move this wherever we need to, again across time. Scale will obviously allow me to increase the size of the stroke, and it'll look very bitmapped for a second, but as soon as I let go, it will be re-rendered again at beautiful quality. And obviously we have rotation as well. Now that's based on the anchor point of the layer, depending on where that is. So let me just bring this back down again so we can see that anchor point. We might have to come down below 100%. And you can see that my anchor point is down here in the bottom right-hand side. So if I take my rotation value and drag it around, the whole path is moving around that particular point. And again, this is something that we can animate. So we have four basic transformation properties there that we can use to adjust all the various geometric values of our shape before we then go in and look at the ways that we can change color and softness and things like that. So those are all handled down here in the transform options. If we close that up, let's have a look at the stroke options now. And as soon as I click that, it will open up a large list of options because obviously there's many we can choose from. But importantly here, we have the start and the end point. Now this is something I briefly mentioned before, where we can choose an animation that goes from the very beginning or the very end and define exactly where that stops and starts. So if I pick up the end point here and drag it backwards, you'll see that my stroke is actually receding along to this point, okay, right the way back, or we can go all the way to the other end, and if we want to, take the start point and do the same. So you have control basically over both ends of the stroke and which time they were drawn, and you can apply very simple keyframes for this. So this is how the write-on effect works. It actually applies these keyframes for us as we do our painting, but you can do that yourself to any stroke that you've done. Obviously here we can also change the color, the diameter of the stroke. It doesn't matter. You can increase that or decrease that at any time in your animation, which is very handy. You can actually just change the thickness of the stroke across time. We also have all the other settings that we've seen already. We have the angle, the hardness, the roundness, and the spacing. All of these things can be keyframed, as well as the opacity and the flow. And if we decide at the last minute that we painted using the wrong channel settings, we used RGBA instead of the other two, we can go ahead and choose those there as well. So you'll see there's a good long list there of items that can all be keyframed and animated to make the strokes work for you, and they're all contained down here. And don't forget, they are on a brush by brush basis. If I just close that one up, let's go to brush 2, stroke options. You can see there's a whole extra set there for that particular brush stroke as well. So do bear that in mind. Every single brush has its own settings. Another thing that you'll notice is the stacking order of the brushes. They are created from the bottom up. You can see brush 1, 2, and 3 and the way that they're stacked here, okay? So again, just bear that in mind because that can also affect the color blending modes that you have applied in the way that they've been stacked one on top of the other. Now I'm actually going to remove these three because we're just going to try one other thing before we get onto moving footage. And I'm just going to use my Apple key or control there just to select each of those three strokes and just hit the delete key and it will actually remove them. Now you'll see it removes the paint effect also. You know that's not a problem because we can just pick up the paintbrush and start painting on the layer again, which is what we're going to do. But we do want to change a couple of settings before we do that. So let's come back up to the paint palette. I'm going to change my duration this time to write on so we can paint something and record its time. So we can just see that in the timeline. That's why I want to show you that. Let's use our shortcut to reduce the size of the brush. And I'm just going to paint something very quickly. Let's maybe just change the blending mode back to normal for this. Doesn't make much difference, but let's go ahead and do that. And now I'm just going to quickly paint across 2 or 3 seconds. And obviously that's been recorded. Again, it completely disappears off screen because we are looking at 0 seconds in our timeline. The first frame is obviously blank. But whilst I've done that, let's just do one other thing. I'm going to come to my duration options and this time set it to constant. I'm going to choose an even smaller brush. Let's go down pretty small. Let's go 10 or 11. And let's choose a different color for this just so it shows up differently to the write-on text we've just created. And let's say you're doing a simple illustration. You're trying to build up some strokes around the outside of a character or something, and you're creating all these nice strokes. Don't forget that every single thing I'm painting here, every single time I'm clicking, I'm getting a whole new stroke inside my timeline, okay? So it looks great. We've got a lot of detail here that we could use to build up an illustration of any particular type, but you do have to bear in mind what happens in the timeline when you do this. Let's go and have a look. And let's use a new shortcut this time. If I hit the P key twice in quick succession, that will activate all of the paint strokes that I have in my timeline, okay? So you don't have to twirl down the effect and search for it. Very simple, just hit P twice. And you'll see that I have 74 brushes. I just sat there and painted, and I was quite happy with what I was doing. But if you scroll through that timeline, you can see that every single one of these has all its own settings, its own blending modes, its own geometric properties, everything else, okay? So do keep your eye on that. You have to be very careful. Now, the one I wanted to point out was brush 1, which should be our write-on text that we created. And I'm just going to drop down there, and you can see that I have 2 keyframes. They're actually slightly hidden at the moment because we're not seeing the options. If we go to the stroke options, we can see that a keyframe was applied for the end point, and that was recorded over the space of about 1 3/4 seconds, which is obviously how long it took me to draw it. So if I do scroll out there, I can see the stroke working its way down through the timeline until it reaches that end point. Pull that down so we can see it. And like I said before, there's nothing to stop us picking up the end point now and saying I want that effect to apply over a longer period of time, or even to the left, and let's make it apply over a shorter period of time. You have complete control over that. The write-on effect is yours to play with, okay? So I just wanted to point out there the importance of having those keyframes. Now, how do the paint tools apply when we're starting to work with real footage and we want to change some of the color of it? Well, let's take a look at that, and for that we're actually going to use a completely different composition. So let's come up here and close down this whole composition, and then let's open the second one here. It's called O2 Painting. And when we open it, you'll see it's a slightly smaller sized comp. It has a small preview of a bottle that we have here. And if you want to just do a RAM preview of that, you'll see that it's a rotation of this shape, and it slowly comes to a stop. And what we're going to do is just to apply a few color changes to it. We're going to change the color of the liquid and maybe the color of the cap as well. Just see how that works on moving footage. So again, I'm going to select this layer, okay, just highlighted it here, and I'm going to hit the Enter key to open a layer window for that, because don't forget we have to paint inside the layer window. And I might just zoom up on that, use my period key to get a bit closer to this. We can always pull our paint palette out of the way there. There we go. And we'll focus up here on the lid to start with. I'm making sure that my timeline is set to 0 seconds. And then I'll come up to the tool palette and go ahead again and choose the brush tool. So we're ready to start painting. And again, we can define our brush size. Let's just hold down our shortcut and click and drag. Let's choose something around about there. And obviously there's a few more settings that we need to change here inside the paint palette. One of which might be the softness of the edge of the brush. Now this is something else we can do via a shortcut. You've already seen that we have the Apple or the Control key to change the size of the brush. However, if you keep the mouse held down, choose the size of brush that you want, but don't let go of the mouse, let go of the Command or the Control key, and just hit the Option key or the Alt key, you can see that we get a second circle in here which defines the softness of the brush. So as I push out towards the edge there, it's obviously going to be very hard with a very slightly feathered edge. Or come all the way down here, it'll be a very, very soft edge brush. So you can choose the 2 radii there that define the size of this brush. So I'm just going to go somewhere round about there, which will give us a bit of softness, but not too much. And that'll be set to what I need. Now the next thing I'll do is just choose the color. I'm going to apply a red cap to this bottle. So go ahead and choose that again from the color picker. Say OK. And obviously let's set our blending mode to color. So it applies its pixels on top of the blue ones that already exist. And now we're ready to paint, so go ahead and just click and drag, but do all this in one stroke just for a second because I want to point out one thing. We can see here that as I click and drag, I'm dragging across the top of the bottle and the color of the cap is changing perfectly. It's exactly what I need, but I'm also spilling color out onto the edge. Now this is actually a keyed clip. There's no pixels around here. It's completely transparent. If you want to, you can click down here and view the transparency. We can see through the bottle and through the background, yet I've actually managed to apply color into the transparent areas, which I don't want to do. So I'm just going to undo that. Let's go back up to where we were. And this time in the paint palette where it says channels, instead of affecting red, green, blue, and alpha, let's set it to just RGB only. Now when we come across and paint, even if I start out here in the transparent area, I cannot affect anything. It's kind of like having preserved transparency turned on in Photoshop, but as soon as I come across the top of the bottle here, you'll see that I'm adjusting the color quite happily as far as I want to go. I can actually bleed over the sides and not worry about anything else being affected. This is a very handy use here of the channels option set to RGB. Now let's do the same. We're also going to change the color of the liquid here, so I'm going to scroll up a bit more. Let's maybe go for green, so go ahead and choose that new color. Let's choose that bright one there, okay? And once again, just go ahead and paint on top of it. It'll be a brand new stroke. It has a new color setting and everything, and we can just quickly paint over the area we want it to be and color outside the lines to get everything that we need. Let's leave all the settings as they are. Let's come down to the bottom and apply exactly the same to the very, very bottom of the shape here to fill in all that liquid. Just fine tune that to the edge, something like that. And now we can just zoom back down, view it from a slightly different size, and go ahead and scroll through your timeline. And you see there that you've done your first piece of color replacement using the paint tool, quite simply by applying color mode and a nice soft edge brush and 3 very simple brush strokes. It's a very interesting effect. Now, painting these strokes has also done a good job of highlighting another problem. One thing you might notice, if we just scrub up here and look towards the bottom of our bottle, I'm just going to zoom up again to 100% size, we can see some rogue green pixels over here on the right-hand side. And if you actually scrub through the timeline, you'll notice them appearing at various points. There's a lot of junk and noise down the bottom here, and the occasional pixel that shows up around the bottom. The reason for that is this original piece of footage was obviously keyed out from a background. We can see it was keyed very well. We have transparency here and everything else works pretty well. But at the bottom, there was a few issues with keying because it was reflected onto a surface, and the key can only go so far, and we have an alpha channel that just has some residue pixels that we can quite easily get rid of. This is a joy again of using the painting tools. If I have a look here at the alpha channel of the layer, we can see those pixels laying around the outside. They show up a lot easier when you're viewing the alpha channel. We can see them flick on and off, okay? Well, we can obviously go in and retouch them. We have the power to do that using the painting tools. So what we'll do is make sure that the channels option here is not set to RGB, but this time is set to alpha, because this is the only channel we're going to edit. And as soon as I choose alpha, you'll see that my colors over here default to black and white, because we can only paint in black and white inside our alpha channel. And I will switch them round, so black is my foreground color because that's the color we're going to paint with. And again, I'll just drag the brush size down because we're going to work fairly small here. Just go ahead and make a few retouching changes. And I'm simply going to paint over these rogue pixels and tidy up the edge here of my alpha channel. I'm not going to make any changes to the color of the layer. I'm just simply doing retouching. And then I can use the page down key and just advance a frame at a time. Just pick another point if I want to retouch. And don't forget, we can add a different stroke every time this happens, but this is a great way to retouch an alpha channel if it has any pixels that need doing so. So just make a few changes here. I won't go all the way through the animation. I can leave that for you to do in your own time, but it's very easy to see here the power of the tool working on an alpha channel. There's a couple of good ones there to finish up with. Another frame, I think I missed one there. Nope, that's all pretty good. I'm happy with that. If we now come back to the RGB channel, we can see that's nice and clean now. We've taken out all of those rogue pixels just by simply painting live into the alpha channel of our layer. So you see there that the paint tools themselves give you great ways of retouching footage, changing its color, and also retouching the inside as well. But there's one other tool that I want to focus on, and that is the cloning tool. This gives us a few great options for some very simple effects. So to play with that, what we're going to do is close down this composition and go ahead and open the third one that's called cloning. Double click to open that. And we can see that this project is called 03 Cloning. Now, what exactly is cloning? Well, cloning is the process of taking a copy of a certain part of an image and replicating it elsewhere. Now, we're going to look at a very interesting way of doing it, but before we do that, let's have a look at the very basics of how it works and obviously how you can have some fun with it as well. If we come up to our tool palette, we can see over here we have the clone tool. It's right next door to the brush tool we were using already. And once again, I can select that. And I obviously want to have this layer highlighted so I can start painting on it with the clone tool. So I'm just going to hold down my Apple key or my control key on the PC, which will temporarily give me the selection tool so I can click on the layer and highlight it. Now I'm ready to start painting if I hit the Enter key to open up a layer window. Okay, so we can now see that my tool is active and I'm ready to start working. Now, just the same as with the paintbrush tool, you can hold down your shortcut and again drag to the left and right to define the size that you're going to work with. But the very simple way in which this tool works is exactly the same as in Adobe Photoshop. You have to select a point somewhere in your image that you wish to clone from, and that's done by holding down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC, and you can see that I get a central crosshair or a target area from which I'm going to copy. So I could take one of Brian's eyes over here, just click on that, again holding down that shortcut, and as soon as I let go, I'm back to my clone tool, and wherever I place this now, I can just click and hold, and you'll see that I replicate that area. And you can see I also have another crosshair there that's over the original eye that shows me the exact area that I'm copying. But you see through that very simple process, we've done a clone. If we just scrub through the timeline there, we can see that that eye is actually moving exactly the same as it is in the other clip. We've simply taken one piece of video and cloned it into another one. That's how the clone tool works. You can certainly have some fun with this. Let's have a look at something infinitely more complicated that we can use this tool to actually make easy. I'm just going to back up a step there, another step, so we remove the clone of the eye. And we're going to take a look at these video clips and why they're set up the way they are. I'm going to close down the layer window for this one so we come back to the main composition. And I'm just going to do a RAM preview so we can see the audio and the video for this clip.
The sky is green. The sky is green.
So we can see that we have Brian saying that the sky is green. Obviously the sky is blue. Well, it might be green in certain places, but it's certainly blue that we want to put in here. Now we do have another clip inside the timeline which has him saying the right word, but it's in a completely different context. I'm going to turn off the video and audio for my top layer and go ahead and turn on the bottom one, so it's a completely different video clip. And again, I'll do a RAM preview so we can hear it.
My car is blue.
Okay, so obviously our aim here is to take the blue word from this in terms of the movement of Brian's mouth and place it into the green clip so we actually end up with the correct version of his speech. Now, we already have a fixed audio in here as well, which I've got down here as layer 2. So we can turn that on and listen to it. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. Let's turn off the bottom two options so we don't hear video or audio for that, but I am going to turn on video for the top layer just so we can hear the corrected audio but with the incorrect video.
The sky is blue.
Okay, so this is obviously what we're aiming for. We're now going to take the lip movement from the blue clip and place it into the green one. Now this does give us a small challenge as well. You may have noticed that when we play the clips back, the timing of when Brian says the sky is green is actually earlier in the clip than when he says the car is blue. That one actually starts a lot later. So if we use the clone tool, you've seen that the clone tool pretty much gives you an immediate copy of the point in time as well as the pixels that you're copying, okay? Well, what we need to do is make it so that we take a point later in time from the blue clip and put that back into the correct point in time inside the green clip. To prepare for that, we're going to lay some markers down in the timeline that show us the points at which the mouth changes to the right place, and then we can pull those together using the clone tool. So what I'll do is I'll advance my timeline, making sure that we have the green clip video turned on, which we do. I'll advance my timeline across to the point where Brian's mouth closes down to say the word is, and then you can see here it's just starting to say green, okay? Let's go for somewhere about a second. That looks about right. Just starts to close up there. Now what I need to do is add a comp marker here. I do that by holding down the Shift key and hitting 1, and you'll see a 1 appear here in my timeline. If I now move across, somewhere around about here, we're going to find our second word, and for that we obviously need to see our second video clip. So go ahead and turn off the video for the top layer, and let's view the video for the bottom one. So this is the blue one, and we can now go through and again find the point where he starts to say blue. All right, so we can see here my car is blue. So let's back up to about there. That'll do. And let's apply another marker. This time let's do Shift 2. We now have 2 composition markers in place, which I can use just the keys 1 and 2 to navigate between. And this is going to help us when we do our cloning. So we now have matched both points together so we can start to piece them together for a finished shot. Now for this, we need to obviously use the clone tool, but we very importantly need to see both layers at the same time in their own layer window, because obviously the clone tools and all the paint tools, as you know, only work inside a layer window. So I'll turn on the video for both of them. I'm going to use my Apple or Control key on the PC to select the 2 clips together, and again just hit the Enter key, and I can view both of them at the same time. Now a handy little shortcut to point out at this particular moment is the fact that we can switch between both of these layer windows using the Shift key and either the period and comma keys. You see that if I hit the comma key, I'll go to the green clip. If I hit the period key, I'll go back to the blue clip. And this is obviously very handy if you're cloning from one image to another. You can very simply bounce back and forth without having to select them or even have them open in separate windows. Now obviously don't forget that we have the comp markers set as well. So if I'm in this blue clip and I hit 2 or if I hit 1, I can again bounce back and forth between the relevant points, and that's very important. So I want to make sure that I'm on marker 2 because this is the point at which Brian says blue, and this is the point at which we're going to copy the information from. So we have the clone tool highlighted. Make sure it's selected inside your tool palette. And obviously come across to this window. Let's click and drag with our shortcut to make a slightly larger brush. And it has a nice soft edge. It's very important, I think, when we're doing this cloning, just to keep a soft edge so the pixels blend together very well. And then what we'll do is again hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and position this cursor at the point that we want to take a copy from. And I would pretty much use this area here right in the center where Brian's teeth are. That's a good line-up point that we can match between both of them, okay? So I'm just going to position my cursor somewhere in the middle there and just click to define my copy point. If I hit the Shift key and the comma now, I can jump back across to the green clip. But don't forget at this point, we also have to hit the 1 key to take me back to the point where Brian is saying green. This is where we do the clever work. This now takes the mouth movement from the second point from the other clip. Now we can drop it in over the top of the first clip at exactly the right point. Now, if you're having trouble positioning this cursor, I'm not entirely sure exactly where I need to paint. How do I tell the exact center? What I tend to do is I do just hold down the Option key again just to position myself. I'm not going to click or anything like that. I'm just going to position myself to where I need to be and then let go of the Option key, and I know that my brush is in the right place. Now I can click and start painting, and you'll see I'm just simply bringing in those pixels from the second clip and then now in place. Okay, that's all I've had to do. And one very important thing here is I have the duration of this brush stroke set to constant, which means that obviously this action will appear from this point on and play through to the end of the clip, okay? Don't make a mistake and set that to 1 frame or something, then you'll only get that 1 frame of information and then the mouth will jump back to the way it was. So do check your settings before you do that. But if I now scrub through the timeline, I can see that we have Brian saying the word, and then we switch across, and you can see that the word blue is in there. The mouth completely changes shape. Well, let's give it a try and see how it looks. I'm going to close both of these layer windows down. Let's come back to the main clip here, the cloning clip. Come down to the timeline. Let's double check that the only audio that's turned on is here for layer number 2. We haven't accidentally left either of the other ones turned on. All we need now to do is a final round preview, and we can see the finished result.
The sky is blue.
Not a bad result.
The sky is blue.
Now what you might notice there as well, there's a slight imperfection that the layer is just shifted off by a pixel or so. When it jumps in there, you can see it just moving across. Well, don't forget that each one of these strokes can be edited and moved using the settings that we looked at earlier on. In the timeline, I'm going to make sure that the top layer is the only one that I have selected, so I can just hold down the Command key or the Control key and deselect the bottom one so only the top one is active. And again, if we hit the P key twice, we will access our clone, and then we can see it there, clone 1. Another thing that's worth pointing out here, I forgot to mention it a little while ago, but you can select any brush stroke that's in there, hit the return key and actually name it. So you can always say, this was a replacement of the blue word. We could also take another word elsewhere and just name each one as you go along. So that's something worth bearing in mind, especially once you have multiple strokes on the path. It will enable you to keep track of them. But what we can do is simply come down. Let's have a look at our options. We want to go to the transform options right here. We have position, scale, rotation, and anchor point. Really, position is the only one that we need to worry about. So let's just pull the main window down here so we can see. And let's just get to the point where the frame starts. And we can see, obviously, that's where the brush begins. That's where we chose our clone point. Probably want to come to the left about 2 or 3 pixels and maybe up by 1. So let's give that a try. Let's make sure we're set on marker 1 there. And we can always back up a frame at a time and forwards a frame at a time to get an idea of how far we have to move. However, if I was doing this inside of Photoshop and I had a separate layer on top that I was compositing like this, I would actually change the opacity of the top layer so as I move it, I can see it match the pixels beneath. It just takes away some of the guesswork. Well, obviously we have that inside our stroke options. We can go ahead and change that. So let's drop that down. We can come all the way down towards the bottom where it says opacity just above flow. And we can drop back the transparency there and actually see through it to the layer beneath. Now I'll go for around about 50%, then we see a good match. And what I'll also do is come up to 100% size so we get a really good idea of exactly where this is falling. Now if we come back down, let's just scroll through the timeline, come back to where position is, I can now drag this left and right and see pretty much a good match as to exactly where my pixels need to be. So you see as I drag back and forth, we can see through to Brian's nose, which is again a perfect alignment point for this because the pixels match almost exactly. Let's go slightly to the left there and maybe just adjust upwards a touch. You can actually see there very clearly the alignment of the nostrils. The colors become dark as they overlap, and this is definitely an advantage of using the opacity settings to do this. If I now come back up, let's set that back to 100%. This should look a lot better. Let's back up a frame. Let's go forwards a frame. There's a slight shift in the cheek there, but you can see that the match of the nose and the match of the mouth is a lot closer than it was before, and that's very easily achieved by simply taking the stroke that we've done and moving it back into position. Everything can be changed. So what I'll do now is let's just zoom back down to the size we were working at. I'll close up everything inside that timeline. Let's go ahead and do ourselves a final round preview and check the results that we've got. So I'll hit the 0 key. Let's let that build that up and let's see how we did.
The sky is blue.
Pretty good result.
The sky is blue.
So we can see there that we've got a great result that actually looks like Brian said the sky is blue. But we've created that using the new cloning tools from After Effects 6, part of the wonderful new paint engine. We've given ourselves a great challenge, and we've succeeded in overcoming it with a great set of new tools.